Lowest growth of nominal wages is again in the present period, less than 1% per annum. But real wages declined during the Bhutto period, and it declined because of high inflation. And I'll dilate more on this as we go along. Inflation, as we can see here, was 17% per annum during the Bhutto period. It has been very low during the Musharraf period. Inflation rate was high during the Bhutto period because this very high development expenditure excuse me, was financed through deficit financing, meaning printing of currency. It's a legitimate way to finance expenditures, but when you overdo it, it causes secondary problems, and the secondary problem was high inflation. And this gives us lessons for today's planners. We need to increase development expenditure to the level that existed in the Bhutto period, but we should not do it through deficit financing. How else can we do it? We do it by switching expenditures. And what expenditure we can switch? Of course, defense. Next, please. Let us look at the social sector development. Look at the Bhutto and the SZA period. SZA period is not bad, but girls' primary education, the best performance is during the 90s. The highest growth in female number of primary schools for girls was in the 1990s. The lowest, Musharraf period. Next, please. Number of secondary schools, highest in the 1990s. The lowest, Musharraf period. Primary school teachers, employment of primary school teachers, the highest in the Bhutto period, lowest in the Musharraf period. Secondary schools, highest in the Bhutto period, lowest in the SZA period. Primary enrollment, highest in the 1990s, lowest in the Musharraf period. Growth of secondary enrollment, highest in the 1990s, negative in the Musharraf period. Girls' education actually declined. Health facilities, highest growth in the Bhutto period and lowest in the Musharraf period. That's it. That's where we end. Basically, I wanted to run you through taxation, investment, employment, inflation, social sector statistics of these 4 periods. And we can see that if you don't agree that Bhutto period was the best, certainly you have to agree that Bhutto period was not the worst, as has been made out. What really happened was that it is said that nationalization destroyed the economy. Hear it very often. My own father used to say this. But what really happened was that the focus of economic activity shifted from the private to the public sector. And actually the overall level of economic activity went up. As we can see that if your public sector investment is increasing at 21% per annum, which is rare, the only country in the world which had done that was Soviet Union in the 1920s. No other country has achieved that kind of growth rate. And imagine if that kind of growth rate had continued, if the size of the economic assets that we had built up, we would be an economic power today. But the next decade that followed, the decade of Ziaul Haq, our public investment dropped to 2.7%, less than 3%. And as a result, today we have an infrastructure that cannot deliver. Let me talk about nationalization and privatization. In principle, there was nothing wrong with nationalization. No one can dispute it unless you are ideological. If you believe that it is not the business of the state to be in business, then of course you can object. But that's an ideological position. You cannot take an empirical position. You cannot take a position based on data that nationalization never works. Nationalization has worked. There is a decision, ideologically you have to make a decision. What is it that you define? What is your criteria of economic development? Is your criteria corporate profits or is your criteria public welfare? If your criteria is corporate profits, then of course nationalization is bad, because corporations don't get the opportunity to maximize their profits. But if you take public welfare as your criteria, then nationalization or public sector investment cannot be disputed, because certain sectors of the economy, which Bhutto described as the commanding heights of the economy, they need to be under state control, if not in state ownership. And this is true in many countries. It is true also in the United States. You know that China wanted to buy an oil company in the US, and the state came in and intervened. A Dubai firm wanted to take over the management of American ports. The United States came and intervened. So the state does play a role in strategic sectors of the economy. Anyone who says that the state should get out altogether actually does not know how state economies are managed. There were flaws in implementation, and it certainly created several problems. But perhaps if a separate public sector enterprise cadre had been created, where only qualified professionals, MBAs, public administration graduates, engineers and others would have been taken in, then the situation that we saw, that a deputy commissioner has been appointed a general manager of a ghee mill, that would not have happened. Those were mistakes. Certainly they were made. Perhaps the decision to nationalize flour mills and ghee mills is also questionable. But on a larger scale, nationalization cannot be disputed in principle. Let us talk of privatization that is happening today. First of all, the privatization policy has never been debated anywhere, not in parliament, not in public. There is no such thing as Pakistan's privatization policy. When you make a policy, you draw up certain principles, you draw up certain objectives, and you take decisions according to those principles and according to those objectives. When you don't have a policy, you don't have principles, you don't have objectives, then you take decisions as you see convenient on that particular day or that particular week. And this is what has been happening in Pakistan. The first arguments, for those of you who are old enough, in the 1990s, early 1990s, to privatize was that they are a burden on the economy. They are losing money. We have to use tax money to subsidize these inefficient companies. Of course, they forgot that many companies were profitable also. But what they didn't forget was that when they started the privatization process in the early 90s, they started by privatizing the profitable companies. The argument was that these are losing companies and a drain on the budget. So they should be privatizing losing companies. No, but they started by privatizing the profit-making companies. So Millet Tractors, which was a profitable company, was privatized. And it continues to be run profitably in private hands. But Zeel Park Cement, another profit-making company, was privatized, and it closed down within 6 months. It ran into a loss. So to argue that private sector is always efficient and public sector is always inefficient is empirically proven wrong. In Pakistan, it has been proven wrong. It has been proven wrong elsewhere. You cannot say that public sector is always inefficient and private sector is always efficient, because there is evidence to show that there are profitable public sector enterprises, and when you hand them over to private sector, it collapses. So these are not ideological positions to be taken. These are positions to be taken on merit. Then today, when Musharraf government is privatizing, the argument they are using is it is not the business of the state to be in business. Their position is entirely ideological. But do you know that PTCL has been sold to Etisalat, which is a state enterprise? So while they started out by saying that it is not the business of the state to be in business, they ended up by saying